Nobody announced it publicly. There was no press conference. No official statement saying what was about to happen. But the decision was already made. While WNBA players were still arguing over numbers, timelines, and leverage, while veterans were hinting at disruptions and public pressure tactics, the league's most powerful partners didn't wait. They moved forward. And that's the part almost everyone missed. Because when people think about control in sports, they usually focus on the loudest voices, the strongest statements, the biggest personalities. But real power doesn't need to shout. It just acts. NBC and Peacock didn't pause. They didn't hedge. They didn't wait for permission. They rolled out the future anyway. And that single move quietly exposed something uncomfortable. The league may no longer be negotiating from fear. It may already be planning for life without its loudest veterans. This wasn't about disrespect. It wasn't about revenge. And it definitely wasn't about one bad negotiation. This was about leverage shifting in real time, and Caitlin Clark sitting right at the center of it. Because once broadcasters decide the product is bigger than the people fighting over it, the fight changes completely. And what happened next made it clear the WNBA wasn't blinking. When NBC Sports dropped that promo, simple, clean, confident, it didn't look aggressive at first glance. No trash talk. No direct shots. Just a calm, almost casual message saying the WNBA was coming to NBC and Peacock. But timing is everything. That promo didn't come after a deal was finalized. It didn't come after players signed off. It didn't come after the noise settled. It came right in the middle of chaos. Right as CBA talks were stalled. Right as players were floating the idea of causing scenes at NBA All-Star Weekend. Right as union voices were trying to apply public pressure. And that's why this wasn't marketing. It was positioning. Because when a broadcaster promotes a season that technically isn't secured yet, they're not guessing. They're signaling confidence. Confidence that the games will happen. Confidence that fans will show up. Confidence that whoever is on the court won't stop the machine from running. That's not accidental. That's leverage. NBC didn't say, "We hope this works out." They said, "This is happening." And that subtle difference changes everything. Networks don't gamble billions on vibes. They plan based on data, audience behavior, and worst-case scenarios. Which means when NBC hit publish, they weren't reacting to the players. They were already past them. What that promo really said was this: the season is moving forward, with or without consensus. And that's the moment the balance shifted. Because for decades, labor disputes in sports worked one way. Players disrupted, leagues panicked, and networks waited. But this time, the network didn't wait at all. They pushed the product anyway. That tells you the league believes fans are attached to the idea of the WNBA, not just specific names. And more importantly, they believe the next wave of stars is already strong enough to carry the show. That confidence didn't come from nowhere. It came from ratings spikes, merch sales, social media engagement, and one player who changed the math entirely. Caitlin Clark didn't just boost interest, she recalibrated expectations. Suddenly, broadcasters weren't asking, "Can we survive tension?" They were asking, "Why would we slow down momentum?" And once momentum matters more than appeasement, negotiations stop being equal. That's why the promo mattered. It wasn't about hype. It was about control. NBC and Peacock didn't threaten anyone. They didn't need to. They simply showed the players that the train had already left the station, and anyone not on board was risking being left behind. And once that reality set in, the rest of the story started unfolding fast. Because if the season was happening no matter what, then the next question became unavoidable. Who is it really being built around? Nobody voted on it. Nobody announced it. And no one officially admitted it. But the moment Caitlin Clark stepped into the professional conversation, the center of gravity in women's basketball shifted, and everything started bending toward her. Not because she demanded it, not because the league handed it to her, but because the audience did. Broadcasters noticed it first. Ratings didn't just rise, they spiked. Social engagement didn't creep upward, it exploded. Ticket demand didn't slowly build, it snapped. Every measurable metric that matters to networks suddenly had one thing in common. Caitlin Clark was attached to it. And once that happened, the conversation stopped being about fairness and started being about gravity. Because sports leagues don't run on seniority. They don't run on legacy. They run on attention. And Caitlin Clark brings attention in a way the league hasn't seen before. Not just for women's basketball, but for basketball as a whole. That's the part that made executives lean forward. She didn't just attract longtime WNBA fans. She pulled in casual viewers, first-timers, people who didn't care about labor disputes, CBA percentages, or internal politics. People who just wanted to watch something electric. That's the audience networks crave. So when NBC and Peacock looked at the future, they weren't asking, who's been here the longest? They were asking, who moves the needle right now? And the answer was unavoidable. Caitlin Clark didn't need to be positioned as the face of the league. She already was in the data. Every clip went viral. Every appearance drove discussion. Every mention pulled eyes from outside the usual bubble. That's why this moment is so uncomfortable for veterans. Because it exposes a truth nobody wants to say out loud. Influence doesn't age evenly. It transfers. And once it transfers, it doesn't ask permission. The league didn't suddenly stop respecting its vets. What changed was the math. When one player's presence can stabilize ratings, protect TV deals, and calm sponsor anxiety, she becomes more than a rookie. She becomes insurance. That's what Caitlin Clark represents. Insurance against stalled negotiations. Insurance against fan fatigue. Insurance against uncertainty. And that's why the idea of replacement players didn't sound crazy to executives, because the replacement wasn't really about bodies. It was about belief. Belief that fans would still show up as long as the future was visible. Caitlin Clark made the future visible. And here's the part almost nobody wants to confront. Fans don't organize around unions. They organize around stars. They follow storylines, rivalries, and momentum, not bargaining tables. So when vets hinted at disruptions or pressure tactics, it didn't scare broadcasters. It forced them to ask a colder question. Would the audience actually leave? And all signs pointed to no. Because the audience wasn't tuning in for negotiations. They were tuning in for what comes next. That's why Caitlin Clark's presence quietly weakened the leverage of everyone else. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but inevitably. She didn't undercut the vets. She outgrew the moment. And once the league realized it had a player capable of carrying interest through turbulence, the posture changed. Negotiations became firmer. Timelines stopped stretching. And public patience wore thin. That's when the narrative shifted from "we need everyone aligned" to "we need momentum protected." And momentum doesn't wait. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable realization of all. The one nobody wants to say directly. If Caitlin Clark represents the future, then hesitation represents risk. And that's exactly why the league and its partners started preparing for something many thought was impossible just a few years ago. A season that moves forward without waiting for everyone to agree. Because once the future arrives early, the past loses leverage fast. Here's where the conversation turns uncomfortable, because this is the part everyone pretends doesn't exist. The idea of replacement players. Publicly, no one wants to touch it. Privately, it's always part of the plan. Every league has one. Not because owners are heartless. Not because they want chaos. But because uncertainty is expensive. And once negotiations drag long enough, contingency planning stops being optional. What NBC Peacock and the WNBA quietly showed with that promo wasn't confidence in agreement. It was confidence in continuity. The belief that the product could still exist even if the loudest voices stepped away. That doesn't mean veterans don't matter. It means the ecosystem is bigger than any single group. Because here's the hard truth about modern sports. Fans attach themselves to storylines, not contracts. They care about who's rising, who's next, and who feels inevitable. And inevitability doesn't wait for signatures. The league already has a wave coming. Rookies with massive followings. Young players built for highlights, social clips, and short attention spans. Players fans are curious about, not obligated to respect, but excited to discover. That matters more than people want to admit. When executives look at a possible delay or disruption, they don't ask, who will be offended? They ask, who will still tune in? And the data doesn't lie. Fans didn't stop watching when rosters changed in the past. They didn't disappear when familiar names retired. They followed the spotlight. That's why the replacement conversation exists. Not because the league wants to erase veterans, but because the audience has already proven it can move on emotionally faster than insiders expect. And Caitlin Clark accelerated that timeline. Her presence didn't just attract attention, it created a buffer. A safety net that allowed the league to imagine continuity without full cooperation. Something that would have been unthinkable years ago. Before, disruption meant collapse. Now, disruption just means reshuffling. That's terrifying if you're on the wrong side of momentum. Because once replacements are plausible, not ideal, but plausible, leverage changes instantly. Threats lose weight, pressure tactics soften, and public sympathy becomes unpredictable. Fans start asking different questions. Not, why isn't this resolved? But, why are they risking the season? And that's when narratives flip. That's when patience turns into frustration. Not with owners, but with players who appear to be blocking something fans are excited about. That's the danger zone. The league understands this. The broadcasters understand it even more. Which is why they didn't publicly threaten replacements. They didn't have to. They simply showed that the machine could keep moving. Because the scariest message in any negotiation isn't "we'll fight you." It's "we'll continue without you." And once that message is believable, even slightly, the entire tone shifts. That's why veteran pressure tactics suddenly looked risky instead of powerful. Why hints at disruption didn't land the way they might have before. And why the league stopped acting reactive. The future was already visible, already promotable, already marketable, and that made waiting feel unnecessary. Which leads directly into the next fracture, the one that exposed how far apart both sides really were. Because when the league finally laid out the numbers, the gap wasn't just wide, it was revealing. And once those details surfaced, the conversation changed from emotional to mathematical. And math doesn't care how long you've been around. At first, most fans didn't want details. They just wanted a resolution. Support the players. Trust the process. Let it work itself out. That's usually how these situations go, until the numbers come out. Because once the CBA specifics started leaking, the story changed. Not overnight, not loudly, but gradually, in a way that was impossible to reverse. What looked like a fight for fairness slowly started looking like a standoff over expectations. The league laid out its offers in pieces. Incremental changes. Adjustments that didn't make headlines but mattered in negotiations. Higher salary caps. Increased max contracts. Housing concessions. Medical protections. Roster expansions. Benefits that hadn't existed before. None of it was perfect. None of it was revolutionary. But it was movement. And movement matters in negotiations. What surprised people wasn't that the owners compromised, it was how often they did. Each revision nudged closer to what players had been demanding, even if it didn't reach the numbers being floated publicly. That's when fans started asking a dangerous question. What are the players giving up? Because compromise only works when both sides move. And the longer that question went unanswered, the more the narrative shifted. This wasn't about owners being generous. It was about optics. About whether the league was negotiating in bad faith, or whether expectations had simply outrun reality. The proposed revenue-sharing percentages became a flashpoint. On paper, they sounded reasonable. In practice, they exposed how fragile the league's finances still were. The WNBA isn't the NBA. Its revenue streams aren't comparable. Its margins are thinner. Its growth, while real, is still recent. And that's where the disconnect happened. Players spoke as if the league had already arrived. Owners negotiated as if the league was still arriving. Both perspectives made sense, but only one aligned with the actual books. When salary cap numbers doubled in public talking points, fans who had just discovered the league through Caitlin Clark didn't see ambition. They saw risk. Risk of overreaching. Risk of derailing momentum right when interest was peaking. That's when patience thinned. Not because fans turned against players, but because they didn't understand why the moment was being stalled. The league had finally found its window. Finally captured mainstream attention. Finally had broadcasters promoting it confidently. And instead of riding that wave, everything slowed down. That's never a good look. Especially when owners could point to concrete changes and players couldn't point to any visible concessions of their own. Public support doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes. Quietly. Through confusion. Through unanswered questions. And once fans feel confused, they stop taking sides emotionally. They start defaulting to whatever feels stable. That stability didn't look like negotiations anymore. It looked like the season moving forward. That's when Caitlin Clark's earlier comments resurfaced, not as headlines, but as context. Her suggestion that both sides needed to compromise suddenly didn't sound controversial. It sounded practical. And that realization split the conversation. Some fans doubled down on loyalty to the VETS. Others started wondering if stubbornness was costing the league its moment. And once that doubt crept in, leverage weakened further. Because leverage depends on unity, and unity depends on clarity. The CBA breakdown didn't make villains. It created uncertainty. And uncertainty is deadly in negotiations. The league sensed it. Broadcasters sensed it. Sponsors definitely sensed it. Momentum was slipping, not because of bad intentions, but because the moment was fragile. That's when the pressure flipped. Instead of players pressuring the league simply waited, confident that time was now working in its favor. Because every day without resolution didn't hurt hype, it redirected it. Fans weren't asking when the deal would be signed. They were asking who was holding things up. And that's when the room started feeling very different. Which leads directly to the moment Caitlin Clark never meant to ignite, but did anyway. A single comment that exposed how divided the locker room, the fan base, and the future really were. It wasn't said in anger. It wasn't a shot. And it definitely wasn't a speech. It was one sentence. Calm. Almost forgettable in the moment. But it landed like a match in dry grass. When Caitlin Clark mentioned that both sides would need to compromise, she wasn't making a power play. She wasn't speaking as a union leader or a league spokesperson. She was answering honestly, the way someone does when they haven't learned, yet how carefully every word will be dissected. And that's exactly why it hit so hard. Because in that moment, Caitlin Clark wasn't speaking from history. She was speaking from the present. From someone who had just watched the league explode in popularity and didn't want to see that momentum wasted. To a lot of fans, it sounded reasonable. To executives, it sounded realistic. But to some veterans, it sounded like betrayal. Not because she was wrong, but because she wasn't supposed to say it. There's an unspoken rule in sports labor disputes. Stars stay quiet, rookies stay quieter, and no one publicly questions leverage. Especially not someone who represents the future. But Caitlin didn't play by that rule, not intentionally, but naturally. She didn't frame it as owners versus players. She framed it as a shared responsibility to move forward. And in doing that, she accidentally exposed how fragile the standoff really was. Because once compromise is acknowledged publicly, absolute demands lose their shine. That's what made the reaction so intense. Some players felt undercut. Some felt dismissed. Some felt like their sacrifices were being minimized by someone who hadn't lived them. And that emotion is understandable. Veterans built the league when nobody cared. They played in empty arenas. They carried the weight without recognition. So hearing the future suggest flexibility, even gently, felt like erasure. But here's the uncomfortable part. Caitlin Clark wasn't speaking as a veteran. She was speaking as the moment. She represents a generation of fans who don't see the past the same way. Fans who discovered the WNBA at its peak, not its struggle. Fans who don't separate labor politics from entertainment. They just want the games. And that difference in perspective created a fault line. Because Caitlin didn't gain leverage by trying. She gained it by existing. Her voice mattered because the audience cared about what she thought. And once that became clear, it changed the dynamic inside the league. Silence would have protected feelings. Honesty protected momentum. And momentum won. The backlash wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was subtle. Cold shoulders. Side comments. Social media reactions that said everything without saying anything at all. The room divided, not officially but emotionally. Some saw Caitlin as naive. Others saw her as pragmatic. Many saw her as inevitable. And inevitability is threatening when it arrives too fast. Because once fans started agreeing with her sentiment, even quietly, the negotiation shifted again. The league didn't have to say, "We agree with her." The crowd already did. That's when patience snapped. Not in anger. In exhaustion. People didn't want drama anymore. They wanted basketball. They wanted to see what the future looked like. And Caitlin Clark was the face of that future, whether anyone liked it or not. And while everyone argued about that one sentence, something else was happening behind the scenes. Something that made the league's hesitation impossible to ignore. Because while the future was ready to be pushed, one of the biggest brands in sports suddenly went silent. And that silence spoke volumes. In a moment when everything should have been loud, Nike went quiet. And that's why people noticed. Because Nike doesn't miss moments like this. They create them. They've built an empire on recognizing cultural inflection points early, sometimes before the athlete even understands what they're becoming. Which is why the decision not to push Caitlin Clark the way everyone expected felt wrong. Not confusing. Not debatable. Wrong. Here you had the biggest rising star in women's basketball. A player driving numbers most veterans never touched. A player pulling in casual fans, non-basketball fans, and skeptics alike. A player whose highlights were crossing into spaces women's hoops had never dominated before. And Nike hesitated. No Super Bowl-level push. No aggressive campaign rollout. No full-court press the way they've done for far less influential athletes in the past. That silence wasn't accidental. And it definitely wasn't financial. Caitlin Clark merch was already moving. Demand was obvious. The upside was staring them in the face. Which means the hesitation wasn't about money. It was about fear. Fear of backlash. Fear of internal politics. Fear of being seen as choosing sides. Because promoting Caitlin Clark aggressively in that moment wouldn't have just been marketing. It would have been a statement. One that said, this is the future, and we're not waiting. And Nike didn't want to be the first domino. That hesitation exposed how tense the ecosystem really was. Brands weren't just watching the league, they were watching the players watch each other. They were reading the room, measuring reactions, calculating risk. And Caitlin Clark, whether she wanted it or not, had become a political figure. Not because of anything she did, but because of what she represented. A shift. Nike had seen this before. They know what happens when you push the next star too fast while the previous generation still feels unsettled. It creates fractures, boycotts, noise, internal friction that no brand wants to be caught in. So they slowed down. But slowing down in a moment like this doesn't feel neutral. It feels strategic. And that's what made people uneasy. Because if Nike was hesitating, what did they know that fans didn't? What conversations were happening behind closed doors? What pressure were they anticipating? The silence felt like a pause before a storm. And it reinforced the idea that Caitlin Clark wasn't just a player anymore. She was a pressure point. Every move around her mattered. Every decision carried weight. And every delay felt like avoidance. That's why comparisons started popping up, quietly at first. About missed opportunities. About how rarely a player like this comes along. About how you don't get infinite windows to define a generation. People started asking uncomfortable questions. Why sign her if you're afraid to push her? Why secure the future and then tiptoe around it? Why protect the past when the audience is clearly leaning forward? And those questions didn't just land on Nike. They landed on the league. Because the longer the hesitation stretched, the clearer it became that everyone was trying not to be the villain, and in doing so, risked missing the moment entirely. Nike's silence wasn't loud, but it was revealing. It showed how fragile the balance had become, how careful every move was, how much tension was being managed behind the scenes. And it confirmed something many had already suspected. The league wasn't just negotiating a CBA. It was navigating a generational handoff in real time. And handoffs are messy, which is why the most powerful players in this situation weren't speaking loudly at all. They were moving quietly. Broadcasters, sponsors, platforms, the ones who don't need approval to shape the future, only the audience. And once you realize that, the next phase of this story becomes impossible to ignore. Because media partners don't operate on loyalty. They operate on trajectory. And when they decide which direction something is going, they don't ask who's ready. They go. This is the part most fans never see. Because media partners don't talk like players. They don't move like leagues. And they definitely don't negotiate like unions. They don't argue about respect. They don't debate legacy. They don't get pulled into emotional standoffs. They follow trajectory. NBC and Peacock weren't watching the CBA the way fans were. They weren't refreshing social media for statements or reacting to who said what. They were looking at curves, trend lines, audience behavior over time. And what they saw was simple. Interest was rising faster than internal disputes could slow it down. That changes everything. Media partners don't ask, who deserves this moment? They ask, where is this moment going? And the answer was clear. Women's basketball wasn't climbing because negotiations were perfect. It was climbing because the product had finally crossed into mainstream curiosity. Because new viewers were discovering it without baggage, without context, without loyalty to past fights. Those viewers didn't know the history, and they didn't care. They came for Caitlin Clark. They stayed for competition, and they didn't want interruptions. That's why NBC didn't wait. Because waiting implies risk. Risk that attention drifts. Risk that momentum cools. Risk that the audience finds something else. And platforms fear one thing above all else: missed windows. A hot moment that isn't capitalized on rarely comes back the same way. You can't recreate cultural timing. You either catch it or you don't. NBC and Peacock saw the moment and chose not to gamble. That doesn't mean they disrespected the players. It means they respected the data more. And data doesn't care about internal politics. It showed that fans were already emotionally invested in the next chapter. That rookies were being followed before playing a professional minute. That conversations had moved beyond the old guard without being told to. That's the quiet truth no one wants to confront. The audience had already started turning the page. So when negotiations stalled, media partners didn't panic, they adapted. They planned. They positioned themselves so that no matter how the dispute ended, they wouldn't lose momentum. That's power. Because once media partners are insulated from disruption, disruption stops working as leverage. That's why public pressure didn't land the same way. Why hints at chaos didn't scare anyone at the top. Why the tone from the league stayed firm instead of frantic. They knew the cameras would still roll. They knew the audience would still show up. And they knew that if the future arrived with, or without everyone on board, viewers would follow it. This isn't cruelty. It's how modern sports operate. Platforms don't build around people. They build around attention. And attention doesn't wait for consensus. That's why Caitlin Clark became more than a player in this equation. She became proof. Proof that interest could survive turbulence. Proof that the league wasn't fragile anymore. And once that proof exists, everything changes. Negotiations stop being urgent. Threats stop being scary. Time stops being an enemy. Instead, it becomes a weapon. And the league started using it. Quietly. Patiently. Confidently. Which leads to the most uncomfortable realization of all. One that reshaped how fans, owners, and players saw the future. Because if media partners believed the audience would stay, then the only real risk left wasn't disruption. It was falling behind the moment. This was never supposed to feel like a divide. For years, the story of the WNBA was simple and unified. Respect the vets, honor the grind, protect the foundation. Fans were taught to see veteran players not just as athletes, but as builders, people who carried the league through seasons when attention was scarce and resources were thin. That respect didn't disappear. But something else showed up. Excitement. And excitement doesn't ask permission. As Caitlin Clark and the incoming wave of stars began pulling attention, the emotional balance shifted. Not because fans stopped caring about veterans, but because they started caring about what was next just a little bit more. That's where the tension lived. Veterans weren't wrong to feel uneasy. From their perspective, the league was finally benefiting from sacrifices they made long ago, and now the spotlight was drifting toward players who hadn't endured those early years. That hurts, and that feeling is valid. But the future doesn't move on feelings. It moves on momentum, and momentum doesn't slow down to explain itself. Fans didn't wake up one day and decide to abandon the past. They simply followed curiosity, followed highlights, followed energy, followed the sense that something new was happening right now. That's why the narrative started changing, quietly at first. It stopped being about who deserves this and became about who represents where this is going. And once that shift happens, it's almost impossible to reverse. Veterans began to feel like guardians of the league's soul. The future felt like acceleration. And those two ideas don't always coexist peacefully. Public comments started landing differently. Statements that once would have been met with sympathy were now met with hesitation. Not hostility, just distance. Fans weren't angry. They were conflicted. They respected the past. But they were leaning forward. And leaning forward is dangerous in moments like this, because it creates pressure without intention. Suddenly, any resistance to moving forward felt like obstruction, even if that wasn't the intent at all. That's how narratives harden. The idea that veterans were blocking the future didn't start as an accusation. It started as a question, a quiet one, the kind that grows in comment sections, group chats, and casual conversations. Why now? Why slow this down? Why risk this moment? And once those questions circulate long enough, they take on a life of their own. That's when leverage evaporates. Because leverage depends on moral clarity, on a shared understanding of right and wrong. But when fans are split, when they sympathize with both sides, pressure loses direction. The future doesn't look like an enemy. It looks like inevitability. And inevitability is the hardest thing to fight. Veterans didn't lose influence overnight, but they did lose narrative control. And once that happens, negotiations stop being about justice and start being about timing. Timing was no longer on their side. Because the league had something it never had before. A fan base willing to prioritize tomorrow over yesterday. That doesn't erase history, but it does rewrite urgency. And urgency is everything in a standoff. As the divide widened, the league didn't have to pick a side publicly. The audience was already doing it subconsciously, not by rejecting veterans, but by embracing the future. And once the crowd leans that way, the decision-makers don't need to intervene. They just let gravity do the work. Which brings us to the final gamble, the one that could either redefine the WNBA forever or expose the risk no one wants to talk about. Because the league isn't betting against its players. It's betting on its fans. Here's the part that makes everyone uncomfortable, because it forces a shift in how this entire situation is viewed. The WNBA isn't gambling against its players. It's gambling on its audience. That distinction matters more than anything else. For decades, leagues feared disruption because disruption meant abandonment. Fans would drift. Sponsors would hesitate. Networks would pull back. A stalled season used to feel like an existential threat. That's no longer true. Not because fans stopped caring, but because fans changed. The modern audience doesn't wait patiently. It doesn't organize loyalty around negotiations. It follows momentum, personalities, and access. If one door closes, attention flows to another opening. The WNBA finally cracked that reality when interest surged beyond its core base. That's why this moment is so dangerous and so powerful. Because for the first time, the league believes it can survive friction without collapsing attention. That belief is the gamble. Owners are betting that fans will still tune in if the games happen on time. That they'll care more about seeing the future unfold than about how the deal got finalized. That storylines will overpower disputes. And all signs suggest they're right. Fans aren't threatening to leave. They're asking when tip-off is. They're sharing highlights, not bargaining updates. They're emotionally invested in what's coming next. That's the shift. Once a league reaches that point, negotiations lose their ability to freeze progress. They can slow things down, but they can't stop them entirely. And that's why the league didn't flinch. It didn't issue ultimatums. It didn't escalate publicly. It didn't frame players as villains. It simply kept moving. Because movement creates normalcy. And normalcy is powerful. If the season feels inevitable, fans accept it. If the broadcast schedule feels locked in, attention settles. If the future feels visible, patience for conflict evaporates. That's the psychology at work here. The league is betting that fans will separate enjoyment from internal politics. And historically they do. Not because fans are heartless, but because entertainment fills emotional space faster than conflict. And Caitlin Clark sits right at the center of that bet. She represents continuity. A sense that something bigger is happening regardless of tension. A reminder that the league's story isn't frozen in one moment, it's accelerating. That's why she's so important to this gamble. She gives fans a reason to stay focused on basketball instead of breakdowns. And when fans stay focused, leverage shifts permanently. This is the point of no return. Because if the league is right, if the audience sticks, then future negotiations will never look the same. Players will still matter. Voices will still count. But the idea that disruption alone can halt momentum will be gone. That's a fundamental change. It doesn't mean players lose power. It means power becomes shared with platforms and fans in ways it never was before. And once that door opens, it doesn't close. The league knows this gamble carries risk. If fans ever decide the product feels hollow without its veterans, everything snaps back. Trust erodes. Momentum collapses. But right now, the audience is leaning forward. And leagues don't step in front of that. They follow it. Quietly. Confidently. And without asking permission. What makes this moment so unsettling isn't the conflict. It's how quietly the future was decided while everyone was focused on the noise. No dramatic announcement. No clear winner declared. No villain officially named. Just movement. While debates raged, while statements flew, while sides hardened, the league's most powerful partners didn't argue. They didn't posture. They didn't threaten. They acted. NBC and Peacock didn't wait for peace. They planned for continuity. The league didn't freeze. It leaned into momentum. And fans, whether they realized it or not, followed what felt inevitable. That's the real takeaway here. This wasn't about punishing veterans. It wasn't about silencing players. And it wasn't about crowning one star above everyone else. It was about timing. The WNBA finally reached a moment it had chased for years. Mainstream attention, casual curiosity, cultural relevance. And moments like that are fragile. You don't pause them. You don't stall them. You either ride them, or you lose them. Caitlin Clark didn't create this divide. She revealed it. She became the symbol of acceleration in a league still learning how to manage speed. Her presence didn't erase the past, but it made waiting feel expensive. And once waiting feels expensive, decisions get made fast. The uncomfortable truth is this. Sports aren't controlled by history anymore. They're shaped by attention. And attention doesn't negotiate. It moves. That doesn't mean veterans stop matching. It doesn't mean players lose their voice. But it does mean the rules changed. The next era won't be built on who sacrificed the most. It'll be built on who carries momentum forward, on who keeps fans engaged, on who fits the direction platforms are already moving. And that reality isn't coming. It's already here. So the real question isn't whether the league moved on too quickly. The real question is who's ready to move with it, and who's still fighting a moment that already passed. Because in today's sports world, the future doesn't wait for agreement. It just shows up. And if you want to stay ahead of where this league and this entire conversation is really going, make sure you subscribe. Because we don't just react to headlines here, we break down the moves happening behind them. And the next one? It's already in motion.